We ready?
We're ready. You didn't have to wait your whole lives for this. All right. I apologize for the delays here. So I want to talk to you a little bit about microplastics, and specifically microplastics in the Mississippi River, which we've been looking at for the past few years in my lab. So a little primer on what are microplastics. These are small pieces of plastic. Think of a Mardi Gras bead. Standard Mardi Gras beads about 7 millimeters in diameter. Microplastics are 5 millimeters in diameter, and they go down from there to nano sizes. We typically characterize these microplastics into 5 groups. Beads or nurdles, which are the raw precursors of plastic resins. Fibers, these can be anything from a piece of monofilament fishing line to something that comes off of one of your down fleeces made of polyethylene terephthalate. Fragments, which are pieces of larger plastic that break down. Foams, these are usually pieces of expanded polystyrene. And films, which can be anything like a piece of saran wrap or some other thin sort of plastic. So where do they come from? Well, one of the big sources is fragmentation of larger plastics. So plastics don't break down in any reasonable time frame. They can take centuries to break down. But they do start to degrade under ultraviolet light, oxygen, and mechanical conditions. So the plasticizers that bind the resins together start to break down with ultraviolet light. This makes plastics brittle. You've probably all seen a water bottle that's been sitting around for a while. You can crunch it up in your hand. Old plastic bag that falls apart. And so this fragmentation of macroplastics is a big source. Paints and coatings. We don't think of paints these days as being made of plastic, but most of our paints and coatings are in fact polymers. And so when paint flakes, you're actually getting plastic flaking off. Bead blasting is another one. This is much like sand blasting, but plastic particles are used to take off corrosion and surface contamination. You can go to Lowe's, buy a 5-gallon bucket of plastic fragments and put it in a compressed air bead blaster and spray it all over the environment. Tire wear. We don't tend to think of tires, we think of them as being rubber, but tires are a composite of rubber and synthetic polymers, and so when you lay a patch of rubber, you're really laying a patch of plastic. And so we all have to replace our tires at some point. That rubber goes somewhere, it goes on the roads, and then it gets washed into our waterways. Laundry is a big one. So whenever you wash your clothing, you know how much lint is in the dryer. Even more lint comes out in the wash cycle and gets pumped down the drain. And if you're washing synthetic fabrics, then the fibers that come off those synthetic fabrics are in fact plastics, and they're going down the drain. Personal care products. Plastic beads are added as abrasives to personal care products as exfoliants and things like that. Polyethylene granules usually. They are not allowed in the United States anymore unless it's a prescription product, but you can go in many parts of the world and still see these products. So when you wash your face with this Neutrogena, all those little dots you see in there are polyethylene. And then the big one that we're going to talk about in this session, although it's not in terms of numbers the biggest one, is the nurdles, the raw resin. So you want to make a Lego, you order the raw resin pellets, melt them down, add the colorant, and put them in an injection molder, and out pops your Lego. So the characteristics of microplastics is they're always getting smaller. So they're always breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments. They also have a very large surface area relative to their volume. So for their size, they've got a lot of surface. And if you look at this piece of styrofoam, this was probably part of a cup or a clamshell at one point, but this thing's just a few millimeters in size. And it's got all this surface area. And the chemical nature of plastics is such that they are hydrophobic, which means they repel water. If you put water on plastic, you'll see it'll bead up. Water is a polar molecule. It's got a hydrogen on one side and a couple of hydrogens and an oxygen. So it's got a net positive charge on one side and a negative on the other. Organic pollutants are nonpolar, and so DDT, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PCBs, these sorts of contaminants, herbicides, pesticides, are generally nonpolar, and they will attach to the surface of hydrophobic compounds. And so these things act like little Ubers for all these nasty compounds. And they hitch a ride on these plastics, and the longer they're in the water, the more they will pick up. And so when an organism eats these things, then it will ingest not only the plastic, which can give it a false sense of fullness. It can block its digestive tract, but it's also going to pick up all these organics that are on the surface. So we started looking in the Gulf of Mexico in 2015, and nobody had looked at how many microplastics were in the surface waters of the Gulf of Mexico at all. We went out about an hour south of Terrebonne Bay, and we found concentrations as high as we find in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, even higher. And so if you know the Louisiana coast, it's not particularly heavily populated, so Homa wasn't likely to be the source of all these microplastics. We figured they were coming down the Mississippi River because we were sampling right in the plume of the river. And there was 100 million people in the Mississippi River basin, and those people, every town, village, farm, is producing plastic, and it's all washing into the various tributaries and coming down the river right past us. So in 2016, we started a sampling program where we sampled the Mississippi River. We wanted to know what were the concentrations and types and seasonal patterns of microplastics in the Mississippi. I'm in Baton Rouge, so we bracketed the main wastewater outfalls in Baton Rouge. So we had 3 stations, and then in New Orleans, it's much harder to get onto the river in a small boat. You really feel unwelcome in a whaler on the lower Mississippi here. So because of logistical issues getting onto the river, we just had 2 sites. One was near the Davis Pond outfall. It's not named after Mark Davis. But, and the other was down near Belle Chase, and it's near the Carnarvon diversion. And these diversions, I'll mention them later, they're very important in diverting water from the Mississippi into our coastal wetlands to carry sediments to rebuild the land. So we did quarterly sampling from 2016 to 2017. We used a manta net. It's a standard net we use to collect plankton at the surface of the water. We have a flow meter on there. We know the surface frontal area of the net. We know how far we tow it. So we know how many cubic meters of water we sample. And we would do 4 replicate tows at each station each time we sampled. So 1 transit across the river from the east bank to the west bank would be 1 sample. And we do this 4 times at each site. So this is typically what our samples look like. It's a mixture of plants and woody debris and lots of plastic. And I didn't choose this because it had particularly a lot of plastic in it, but if you look carefully, you can see a bottle cap in here. You can see fragments. There's a couple of nurdles. And if you look in the sample, you'll see lots and lots of little styrofoam fragments. So let's get to the numbers. All right, so here are our results for that over 330 days we sampled. I'm going to break this. The top panel is the smallest size fraction that we measured, 0.5 millimeters to 1.99 millimeters. When we get the sample, we pour it through a series of sieves, and we size fractionate it. And our net had a mesh size of 333 microns. So we figure we can quantify what's in this 0.5 to 2 millimeter size fraction. The next size fraction is 2 to 4, and the other one's 4 to 5 millimeters. Red is Baton Rouge, gold is New Orleans. I now know what the RGB values are for the Saints gold color. So if you look at that, you really don't see a big seasonal pattern. Even though we know the Mississippi River's in flood stage right now, and in the springtime much more water comes down, we don't tend to see a change in the abundance of microplastics over the course of the season. So for that reason, we just took the mean values. So the gold horizontal line in each plot is the mean concentration in particles per cubic meter for New Orleans, and the red is Baton Rouge. And New Orleans is higher than Baton Rouge, and you would expect that because as the water comes down the river, more plastic is flowing into the river. The difference gets a little smaller as you get down to the larger size fractions. I'm not going to present these results yet, but by differencing these, we can calculate how much Baton Rouge is contributing, how much New Orleans is contributing, and how much Chemical Alley is contributing. And I'll just throw out there that we don't get nurdles in Baton Rouge. They're rare. In New Orleans, we get lots of nurdles. And so Chemical Alley is definitely contributing nurdles to the lower Mississippi River. All right, so let's put this into some kind of perspective. This is the Mississippi River discharge over the period that we sampled. Red line, again, Baton Rouge. The gold line is New Orleans. So you can see that they're very similar, higher flow rate out of Baton Rouge than New Orleans. That's because before the river gets to the gauge down near Belle Chase, some of the water is diverted out of the river through Davis Pond, and some is diverted out through Carnarvon. So if we take that into account and just calculate an average discharge for the lower Mississippi River in cubic meters per day here, we're up to a little over 2.5 billion cubic meters per day at peak flood stage. And the equation that we use is basically Baton Rouge minus the sum of New Orleans, or of Davis Pond and Carnarvon diversions, plus the New Orleans flow divided by 2. So if we multiply that, we have our estimates of the average concentration of microplastics in cubic meters per cubic meter, and we have the flow rate in cubic meters per day, we can get a daily microplastic flux, all right? So the y-axis is in billions of particles, and it goes up to about 2.5 is the top of the y-axis. The black line is the average, and the intervals are the 95% confidence intervals on those. If we sum those and correct for a year, so it was a 330-day sampling period, we estimate an annual flux of particles between 0.5 millimeters and 5 millimeters, 325.3 billion particles per year coming out of the Mississippi River, which is a lot of plastic. What is it per capita? Well, if you divide it by the population of the Mississippi River Basin, that means every man, woman, and child in the Mississippi River Basin is contributing somewhere between 2,449 and 4,057 particles per year into the Mississippi River. Now, that's a lot of plastic, and when you look at global forecasts of plastic or global reports on plastic pollution, we tend to blame other people. It's not us. So this was a rather unfortunate editorial that came out last month in the Wall Street Journal that plastic bags help the environment. But one of the things they point out, they cite a paper from Nature Communications. 86% of all the ocean plastic comes from Asia, and virtually all the rest from Africa and South America. Well, we don't have any measurements for the Mississippi River until now, and so absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We just didn't have the data. We've got a lot, we're contributing a lot of plastic. So it's not just these guys that are responsible for the plastic in the ocean. The high concentrations we have in the Gulf of Mexico are coming from here. It's not being carried in via the loop current from Honduras or someplace else. The other thing is we are only sampling the buoyant fractions of the plastic, all right? So we're only sampling plastic that floats. And it's a very turbulent river system, so not all the stuff that's at the surface is always at the surface. It's being swirled around in this river. So we're underestimating even the buoyant fractions, but then, I mean, think of Mardi Gras beads. Those things are made of polycarbonate. They're very heavy. They're on the bottom of the river. So we're not getting the heavier fractions of plastic. And if you just take our average values for each of our stations and put the median size class, you can see there's an exponential increase in the abundance as we get to smaller plastics. So if we project that down to very small fractions of plastic, we're probably in the trillions or quadrillions, depending on how far down you want to get. So what's our next steps? We're going to calculate the contributions by Baton Rouge and New Orleans. We have those numbers, but my grad student Karen wants to make sure we've QA/QC'd them before we talk about them. We want to calculate what the contribution is by chemical alley. We have data on all the polymers, so what are the polymers in each size class, what are the abundances of the different types of plastic, and then we got to get this stuff published so we can get it out in the literature. And I'll just end with, I've got some really talented people that I work with. I'm grateful for that, and we've been funded by Louisiana Sea Grant, the Lamar Family Foundation, Thermo Fisher, and I want to thank Anouk and Tulane, all the law students, for organizing this. Thank you.
So we now know it's here. It's not just out there, and it's going by our doors. It's in the Gulf of Mexico in large concentrations. And the Gulf of Mexico is a place that Diane Wilson knows a lot about. She spent a great deal of her life in and around it, and I'm going to let her tell her story, and then we'll get to the lawyers. Diane?
Y'all can hear me all right? My name is Diane Wilson. I'm a fourth-generation shrimper from a little fishing town called Seadrift, Texas. It's in Calhoun County. Corpus Christi is down below us, and we got Galveston Bay up above us. And basically, I'm going to talk about Formosa Plastics, which put in probably about a 5 billion chemical expansion around between 1989 to the current time. And it's a 2,500 acre chemical plant, plastic, and probably 3,000 workers. And they have a lot of plastic. And what you see up there is the plastic pellets, or some people call them nurdles, and where you see these right now was outfall 6. Formosa has 13 stormwater outfalls. And a stormwater outfall, as y'all look like lawyers out there, I'm sure you already know this, is that it's stormwater, and you're not supposed to be having these floating pellets. Well, Formosa has a real problem about losing their plastics to the environment. Matter of fact, when we filed suit and we did discovery in a 2016 memo, Formosa admitted that they had been losing pellets and powder to the environment since for 26 years, and they had never reported any of it, and TCEQ, the state environmental agency, had never gave them a fine or even a notice of violation on it. And so what you see now is tiny pellets out of one of the stormwater outfalls, and it was in Cox's Creek, and that was just one of the areas where we sampled. This is Formosa Plastics, Point Comfort, Texas. It's a very small little village, and since Formosa has came in there, the population has decreased in half. The elementary school has shut down. The state park is polluted. Formosa bought it, and the school now is owned by Formosa, and it's a training center. This is Formosa Plastics during Hurricane Harvey, and I believe they were one of the top emitters in the whole state of Texas. I believe 60,000 pounds of emissions during Hurricane Harvey. And also, one of the things about Lavaca Bay, Matagorda Bay, is there's a lot of fisheries there. There's shrimpers, there's oystermen, there's crabbers, there's fin fishermen, and there's also sportsmen. Matagorda Bay, Lavaca Bay, which is the bay that I'm going to show you all of the, where all the pellets and powder is. In 1928, there was more shrimp exported out of this area than any place in the United States. And now there are no shrimp boats, there is no shrimp, and the fish houses are shut down. This picture here is one of the reasons why I started on this little journey about finding all of Formosa's plastic pellets. I am basically a lone woman. I've been fighting Formosa for 30 years and no support. And matter of fact, for a long time, the newspapers would not even cover it or wouldn't even allow my name to be spoken. And so I would have workers from the plants that would talk to me. And this worker, he worked in utilities, wastewater, and he had been noticing all of the pellets in the powder that were all over the sidewalk. They were in the ditches. They were in all of the wastewater units. When he was down at the stormwater outfalls, there were pellets everywhere. And when he would take his little boys fishing, when they would go on the bank, the kids would climb back in the skiff and their feet were covered in pellets, and he could not figure out how this was all happening. So he took the FBI and TCEQ, that's Texas State Environmental Agency, and they took them out to Formosa's discharge. And you can see in the background, that's Formosa. The water is Lavaca Bay. That's where their new discharge site was. This is a 2000 picture, and all of that white was pellets, literally covered the entire, the whole island. And the FBI took a picture of it, and that was the end of it. Here's another picture. We managed to convince the EPA, matter of fact, her name was Nancy Fagan, about one of the only EPA ladies I ever managed to talk to, really. And anyway, she did a surprise inspection at Formosa in 2010, and we were telling her about the problems with the really it started out some of the powder, because there was so much powder, the workers were being exposed, and also it was causing explosions because there was so much powder in these units. And when the EPA went in there, they took a number of photos, and you can see the powder in the ditches, in the storm ditches. It was on the roads, it was in the units, it was all over the workers, it was down at the outfalls, and it was in the bay. And the EPA did nothing. Here is what they'll tell you is, you talk to any company about, have you lost any pellets? And they say, well, maybe at the railroad track we might lose a little bit. Well, you see that white area there? That's a little bit of pellets they lost down at the railroad track. Okay, this is a real interesting picture, because this is the supervisor of the SPVC unit at Formosa, and that's a specialized polyvinyl chloride powder. And this happens, he said, weekly. And what you see down at the bottom over there is one of the powdered emissions, and it looks like a blizzard. You cannot see anything. And this unit is 9 stories tall, and it's open to the entire environment. And this picture over here toward the left, that's the top of the 9th story, and you can see it's probably like 8 inches thick of this powder that was released. And what the guys do is they go to the 9th floor and just start barreling off to the side, and it's wide open. The bay's out there, the creek's out there, the units are out there, it's in the wide open. And the red vacuum truck, that's Formosa's largest vacuum truck. And in this particular release, there was so much powder that, the stormwater was backing up, so it was pushing it back into the unit. So they were trying to vacuum it up. They made 6 trips, and on the 6th trip, it was so heavy it blew out the tire. And that's what that photo's all about. So I've had a lot of reporters that would come down to Cox's Creek, and they would see all this pellets and this powder out there, and they're like, how on earth is this stuff getting out here in the water? They really could not figure it out. And it's like, that'll tell you a little bit, because you're right on the water, and you got this southeast wind blowing, you got rain, you got hurricanes, and you got all these outfalls, and none of them work. Some of them are going the opposite direction. So that's one reason why we got a problem. Again, this is a picture of one of the workers the EPA took, and he's in the bagging, and as you can see, he's got a red handkerchief, and if they wanted to have a mask, they had to go to Walmart and get their own handkerchiefs. And that's pretty much one of the reasons is Formosa is a bit cheap. This is the pellets and the powder that is on the creek of Cox's, on the bank of Cox's Creek. This is where Formosa has approximately 12 stormwater outfalls. It goes out of the outfalls, it goes into the creek, and then when the water falls down, it it's either washed upon the banks or it's in the vegetation, and this was just one tiny area. And also, we have a problem with all of these microplastics, all of this powder. It encrusts on the vegetation, so all of the vegetation you see around there is covered with this crystallized type of microplastic powder. Here is an example of one of the samples we took. That's probably, I'd say, 25,000 pellets. And the worker, he probably got it up with a scoop of a pool net. That's what they use. And we, in our 4 years of sampling to show Formosa's illegal discharges, in 4 years, we collected 248 samples. And this was typical of one of them. This shows a picture of the vegetation that is out there, and there is pellets embedded all in the roots of the grass, the vegetation, you name it, it's covered in pellets. Here's an example of the powder that I was talking about. It goes out these storm ditches, and it's all over the place. And we have had fishermen who have come and told us they caught fish with pellets and powder in their gut. We have had oystermen who tell us when they shuck oysters, they find it within the oysters. And an interesting thing is that not only is it probably impacting the fisheries, but we had an expert, and our lawyer, one of our lawyers, David Fredericks, will tell you, is that they tested the pellets for one chemical, and it was mercury, because we got a mercury superfund out there, and it's picking up the mercury. And this is another example, Lavaca Bay, and pellets and powder floating on the water. And this one is, it's probably not so much having to do with the plastic. It had to do with that big flare, all that huge flare I showed you in the beginning and all that black smoke. Well, it settles down on the ranchers, and it settles down in the creek, and I believe the state finally made a report, and they said they determined that deposits of the particulate matter from the Formosa Point Comfort plant found in sufficient concentration and of such duration to adversely affect human health or welfare, animal life, or property, or as to interfere with the normal use and enjoyment of animal life or property. And here is a core sample at Formosa's industrial outfall in Lavaca Bay. It's around 9 million gallons per day. And this was in the scientist, it was the Heart Research of Gulf Studies in Corpus Christi, and that was a core sample, and that's what they found in it. And they said they had found that there was a long-term benthic degradation in Lavaca and Matagorda Bay. I think it had declined 100 times in abundance and tenfold in diversity. And that's from Formosa's discharge into the bay. This shows you what Formosa does when you file a lawsuit and you show pictures of what you're finding out there. So they hired a contractor, and they probably had like 15 guys, and 4 times a week they go out and they water blast the banks, and they water blast the water. And what it does is, and also they cut down the trees to get to the pellets, and what it does is they washed out every bit of dirt on that whole thing, and all it was bare roots. And they have been doing this for since 2017, and they continue to do it. This is outfall 8. Like I said, Formosa has 13 of these. This outfall, you could probably land a small plane on it. This is again another picture of workers sandblasting, and the picture on the other side is one of the skiffs, and they fill the plastic debris and they stick it in those little bags and they throw it in the landfill because you cannot recycle these plastic. Or is it? Okie doke, almost there. All right, and this is just a picture of before and after. Is on one side is what Cox's Creek looked like, and then it shows a month later, and it was like a desert. All the vegetation was dead, and there was just bare mud. Here are two of the workers out there. The white-haired guy is he was a shift supervisor at the PVC unit. That's me in the kayak. I was fixing to go over there, boom. And more of us. And that was our samples. We had 2,248 samples, and we put it on a goat cart and hauled it into federal court and put it through the security ramp. Anyway, and so, and I'll let our lawyer kind of give you the breakdown of the lawsuit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As you can tell, Diane's very enthusiastic about this, and that helps a lot. So if I want to get back to the PDFs, how does that work? So what would be a good, an appropriate amount of time for me to talk? 12, 15 minutes? That long?
10, 12 minutes?
I can do 12 minutes.
And we'll run over a little bit. The next session doesn't start until 5, so we can.
Our PDF is
We
getting
owe
worse.
you this, and we owe our audience.
There we go. I can do that.
Okay.
No, take your time, please.
Well, I don't want to take too much time. I mean, you know, there we go. Okay. So as I think everybody here knows, we've had a little trouble getting things exactly how we want them.
Okay, yeah, so when you want to go to the next one, just scroll down.
I'll do it. Okay. So I'm David Frederick. I'm one of a 5-lawyer team that worked on this case. And actually, officially, my client is the San Antonio Bay Estuarine waterkeeper, and the waterkeeper himself is right here today. But the reality is, obviously, so Diane Wilson was individually one of the plaintiffs also. Everybody worked together, and anyhow. So I'm going to try to hit on kind of like, not so much criticism of Formosa, which would be richly deserved, but rather, you know, sort of things that I think, I don't know how many of you are lawyers, and it looks like a number of you might be students, things that would be almost like lessons learned kind of stuff. Let's start out with where Formosa is, or where really the Vaca Bay is. Vaca Bay is there, obviously, but that's about halfway between Corpus Christi and Galveston, and Galveston's basically the same thing as Houston. So it's kind of remote. I mean, it's not real remote, but well, you can't get there very easily. That means TCQ doesn't go down there very often, and EPA went down there even less often. There is, as Diane was saying, a Superfund site, which looks kind of like it's a little kind of reddish, orangish, up there alongside Cox Creek. That's immediately south of the Formosa facility. Diane was saying that the lead, almost said that the mercury from that Alcoa site was adhering to the pellets in the bay. I myself never became convinced that we could prove that. It's logical in a way, but another logical thing is that mercury's heavy, it falls to the bottom, the nurdles that we were dealing with float. So it's a complicated thing. We did have some tested, and honestly, I think that our scientists felt this just wasn't solid enough to actually make the allegation, in a court of law anyway, but what everybody does worry about was, I think Mark talked about earlier when he was up here. You do worry that these plastic nurdles are going to be like transport strata for whatever happens to be in the water. I mean, mercury is the thing we all know about, but an aluminum factory, an aluminum plant spews out all kinds of chemicals, as does Formosa. So anyhow, the whole concept of these nurdles being a way to transport bad things is a solid idea. Notice that we are close to the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. That's that smallish green unit down here sort of at the south end. That's, of course, where I think all the whooping cranes go in our country for the winter, but certainly that's the place we hear about most of the time. Below that, there's something called the Powderhorn Ranch, which is a great big deal in Texas. It's the Nature Conservancy and various other organizations teamed up to pull this into public hands. It's a huge piece of property. Anyhow, punchline here is the area where Formosa is located it's an environmentally significant place just because of some of the other natural resources that are around there. Okay, so just kind of turning on to points that might be of interest related to the litigation. I would say that we got kicked around, not kicked around, we were moved around. Our dockets were equalized a lot. And so we went through 5 judges, getting to Judge Kenneth Hoyt, who's normally in Houston, but who also does practice in Victoria. Victoria is probably maybe 60 miles, is it that far from? 60 miles from Formosa's plant. So as just blind good luck would have it, if any of you are taking environmental law courses, he was also the judge for Cedar Point Oil, which is a Sierra Club v. Cedar Point Oil, which has come to be a fairly significant case in environmental law because of an expansive understanding of what we did not have to prove in order to establish standing in the Cedar Point Oil case, and the Fifth Circuit upheld it. So although the other side, Formosa's side, thought, we've got them now because Judge Hoyt only awarded, I can't remember now what it was, $128,000 or something like that in that Cedar Point Oil case. They're not going to get any money from us. They could win, our plaintiffs could win, and we just won't get anything. Anyhow, I was very happy to end up with Judge Hoyt, but it was a long, rambling, discourse through several other judges to get there. And the docket equalization thing is real. And it was, of course, made much worse by the slow rate at which our government is replenishing the judges' ranks, or was at that time, replenishing judges' ranks as benches became available. And Texas is just a fast-growing place, so there's, lots of things to do in federal court. It's down there by the border. Anyhow, we didn't have enough judges, and we were lucky to get a good judge. He's a Reagan appointee, so he's been around a long time. But he was a good judge, and it helped us a lot. The judge you get is important. In this case, we talked a lot about, what would be, at the same time, we'd sent notice letters, and, we were gearing up to litigate. TCQ had actually initiated, after we were far enough down the road, it initiated an enforcement case. And so throughout our entire litigation, which lasted about 3.5 years, there was also going on the side this little administrative enforcement case. Let me see if I can get something here. I don't want to talk about that a whole lot. As long as this thing we're looking at right here is a picture from EPA inspection in 2010, where you can see all the pellets, and of course, same thing here. This is a little helpful if I can get it big enough. I don't know. There we go. There's an entire hour that many of you would find fascinating about how our state agency went about figuring out what it was going to do by way of enforcement against Formosa. You would just be appalled. Almost everybody would be appalled. But the punchline on all this is that TCQ picked out this 43-day period, which is that little red horizontal line, kind of in the midst of this longer chain of events. So on the far left side of your chart is when Diane and her friends start picking up nurdles. This is her first pellet collection is January 31st of 2016. And way over here on the other end of the chart is when the judge signed our consent decree in December of 2019. And then there's some events in between there that in light of time, I just won't bother to talk much about. But out of that whole period of time, TCQ picked 43 days and did some enforcement work on that. And the entire time that our litigation was ongoing, then of course we were having to deal with both Formosa's allegation that, well, the state's taking care of this, and if you're not legally barred, which we weren't, from pursuing our citizen suit action, you're nonetheless just wasting federal resources. And they also were trying to get their judgment, or their administrative order from TCQ, set up in such a way that it would, when introduced into court, in our case, tend to set standards that our judge would probably follow because it had been what the state decided, and fulfill the philosophy that Formosa had, that we could just beat them, bloody in the courtroom, and we'd get, $200,000 or something like that, to just, nothing at all. We had to deal with that. The permit term we were seeking to enforce says that Formosa may discharge no more than trace amounts of solids in its discharge. Well, trace amounts just isn't the kind of precise regulatory term we'd all like to have. And sure enough, Formosa had all kinds of theory about what a trace amount might be. I mean, is it a trace amount compared to how much we produce in an entire year? Is it a trace amount compared to how much we produce in 20 years? Should we look at mercury? We could figure out like what's a trace amount of mercury, and we make some sort of analogy to then what's a trace amount of pellets. Well, we overcome that, obviously, and really did it just by dint of, you gave the number, but it was 2,000 bags or 2,000 sample.
Yeah, 2,046, yeah.
The judge, you can't take into a courtroom, and we did take into a courtroom, 2,000, well, we took to the courthouse. We didn't actually get to bring all the bags into the courtroom, but we brought a subset of them in. And the judge saw that there's just like, bag of pellet after bag of pellet. And once you've seen a few hundred bags, you're past the part where you're even thinking this could possibly be a trace amount of anything. This, and photographs. Every time somebody collected a sample, they also took photographs and did videos. And, it's not the sort of chain of custody, absolute rigidly intellectually sound documentation of proof that all us lawyers would like to have. But when you've got 2,000 of those things, it's, anybody who's been on the bench for more than about 6 months will appreciate that, yeah, this is real evidence. There might be some sort of technical little thing didn't go right here, but 2,000 of them didn't get screwed up. So anyhow, we overcame the trace amounts thing. Then there was a legacy pellets issue. Okay, so we had a bunch of pellets. Like Diane said, these things have been discharged probably 20 years, but at least 10 years we know of. And so Formosa said, well, we're not discharging anymore. In fact, we haven't been discharging since your notice letter, really. Those pellets you see out, those are just legacy pellets. Those were discharged some other time, got stuck in the banks, and then the storms came along and stirred them up, or they got stuck on the bottom and the storms came along. Well, nobody who worked in the factory believes that. They've seen the pellets are nice and white when they come out, and after they've been out in the environment for a while, they turn kind of yellow. And anyhow, we were able to beat that back, and we're actually, one of the few good things that Hurricane Harvey did for us is it cleaned out Cox's Creek. It's not up there. Well, Cox's Creek, which the creek over there on the sort of to your left, I guess our right of Formosa as you look at this. Cox's Creek is where most of these pellets were found, and as good fortune or bad fortune, or however you want to analyze it is, Hurricane Harvey just cleaned that creek out. And so there was a period of time there when even Formosa could hardly explain where the pellets were, anything that came along after Hurricane Harvey, which was September or so of 2017. So it's 2 years before we wrapped up the case. Okay, let's see here. It's a circumstantial evidence case. I guess that's probably pretty obvious to you. But I was a DA in the early days of my life, and I hated circumstantial evidence cases when I first got there because I come to law school. I thought circumstantial evidence is almost like no evidence. But of course, jurors found circumstantial evidence to be plenty okay. I mean, it's just kind of like how people make most of their decisions that they make in life. So our case, which wasn't from an engineering perspective as tight as you would like it, because we very rarely actually just saw a bead or pellet come out of one of these outfalls and slip out into waters of the United States. We mostly saw them after they're already out there. So what Diane was saying about how, those pellets, they just fell out of some rail cars, or those pellets were, okay. Enough circumstantial evidence, judges are easy with it. I think the thing most people are probably going to be really interested in is let me slip up here to the judgment that we did get. We went to trial. Real quick, this is just the sort of detail that went in to collecting all of these 2,000 some odd samples. Every time samples were collected, there's a little note like this written and taped to the sample bag, and it says, you know, like where it was and when it was and how was the wind and who collected it, and you know, this was taken by Ronnie, who took probably 1,500 of these samples. And David Sumter was with him. Generally, Ronnie is driven around by David Sumter, so somebody's taking pictures and somebody else is collecting samples, and it's, you know, pretty. This is, real quick, Diane talked about this hydroblasting that you see in that photo. This is what it does. You're looking at the same scene 3 weeks apart. On the left is what it was before they started hydroblasting. On the right is what it looked like after hydroblasting. So that sign you can see sort of in the middle of the picture on the left is the same side that's on the right picture. It's just horrible and completely indifferent. Okay, so this is what the judge said. And the reason we were able to get such a good settlement. The judge said, first place, Formosa's violations were enormous, excuse me. And he said, you know, there's like 736 days of discharges into Lavaca Bay, so that's the big area. But in addition to that, there were 1,149 days of violations back over there on Cox's Creek, referred to Formosa as a serial offender. Well, Formosa, it should have taken us seriously. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 some odd years. I've won a few cases. We had this woman, well, first we had at least, at different times, we had 3 Texas Rio Grande legal aid lawyers on our team. And they were youngish, but they'd clerk for federal judges. They'd graduate the tops of their classes. I mean, these were people that if you just looked at them on paper, you'd say, yeah, I bet that person's not a fool. Anyhow, and then we had a good woman on the West Coast who actually was on contract to TRLA, but Harvard undergrad, and you know, somebody else you'd think in UT law, you'd think, yeah, sure, these people can practice some law. Formosa didn't look at it that way. For the first, like, I don't know, 28 months or something like that we would periodically have settlement negotiations with them, they always come in the door just, you know, oh, how about we give you 50,000? How about we give you 75,000? You know, anyway. After the judge said this stuff, they weren't talking that way anymore. They actually brought in a settlement counsel who I think really waked them up. I think they'd gotten really, I think the trial lawyer who tried the case for them was just mortified. He didn't have a case, and he's just trying to do the best he could. But they also weren't listening to him. They'd never seen him before. And then their regulatory lawyer, whom they really trusted, who's been helping them for 20 years now, you know, he didn't know what was going on. He didn't appreciate how big a potential fall Formosa could take. Okay, so anyhow, let's not. We worked out a settlement, and you know, I've highlighted in red pretty much the things I consider to be important about our settlement. Make it smaller, we can all see at the same time. First place is spread over 5 years. So when you hear that we got $50 million worth of mitigation projects, that's true, but spread over 5 years, so it's like $10 million a year. Formosa is a company that Formosa USA, our defendant, is a company that in the last generally circulated on the internet financial statements reflects that it made $900 million after taxes in 2017. So actually, our $10 million a year out of $900 million, we're proud of it. It's a great big recovery by environmental standards, but Formosa's hardly going to notice it. And they've got some auxiliary costs. I mean, they're going to have to pay their lawyers. They had to pay us. But even so, you're just not getting up above, you know, like 1.3%, something like that, of annual, 2017 annual net profit. So, yeah, they're going to clean up the flooding problem, they say, and look down there a little bit down the way there. We've got like I didn't put her on here. We've got our engineer who's working with Formosa. They've come to respect her. They had never really known that there were such things as stormwater engineers, as opposed to just generic engineers who make plastics. So they've been designing their stormwater system, some of which ran uphill. Some of their stormwater system ran uphill, drained uphill. They like our woman. She's got some good ideas. She knows some stuff. We'll see how it works. I mean, we're all in sort of happy, good, feeling good kind of mood right now. But they're going to clean the place up. The most interesting thing, so we've got $50 million down here, and we got a trustee that's going to oversee this $50 million. And the 50 million is going to grow also because we've also got this compliance monitor that all the parties have agreed to. And this person is, and we're all just trusting this person to, shoot straight. Formosa's not going to be able to clean up this plastics problem in any really short period of time. So over the next 5 years, there are going to continue to be some nurdles get loose. And this guy is going to determine for us and for Formosa whether there's been a violation. And if there's been a violation, Formosa's going to pay penalties that I've forgotten what they are for each one now. Do you remember, does it go up?
Yeah, 15,000 the first year per day.
Okay, and it goes up to like close to 50.
50,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay, so there's going to be some more money added to this pot as time goes by. We've got a trustee to manage the pot. The pot that we know about is going to go to, and the most exciting thing to me, not the most exciting thing, but I am excited about it. There is this group called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. And they're going to set up a co-op, is what they're going to do. Help us set up a co-op, help Diane and her neighbors set up a co-op in Lavaca Bay to see what could be done to help revitalize the shrimping, oystering, fishing industry. So this is going to make it possible. It's $20 million. They're going to be able to have, equipment that lifts boats out of the water and ships out of the water and helps you fix them. And probably going to get some fancy electronic equipment that people haven't had previously. I mean, we don't know exactly what all it's going to do, but our hope is it's going to become a way to empower local people. They catch their shrimp, their haul, whatever. It goes directly to Whole Foods. There's no middlemen involved. We'll see how it works. And then there's another, another $30 million worth of other things that are going to happen. So I guess, we're short on time this evening. We were really lucky, or maybe, who knows, I don't know what the rules are anymore at DOJ. DOJ has got all kinds of papers out there about how you can't have consent decrees that don't give any penalty to the federal government, any civil penalty. There's not a civil penalty in here. All this money is going to be used locally. So anyhow, we thought that was going to be a potential stumbling block, and it just didn't materialize. Let me let Lauren have some time, and then we can answer questions afterwards if people want to stick around long enough.
Next up, and closing out our panel, will be Lauren Packard from the Center for Biological Diversity.
Is it all right if I go till 5:05, 5:10? Okay. So thank you for having me. The previous panelists did a really great job talking about the dangers of microplastic pollution, granules, flakes, pellets, but the plastic pollution crisis is broader than that. Obviously, there's the plastic that ends up in our oceans and degrades into tiny pieces, but there's also the plastics from the pollution from manufacturing these plastics, which include hazardous air pollutants, toxics, greenhouse gases, soot, smog, all kinds of horrible things. So at the center, our approach to the plastic problem has really been centered on the production piece. So trying to stop permits for new facilities so they aren't built, and ensuring that if facilities are built, the standards that apply to them are stronger and more effective. So Formosa, which we've talked a lot about this evening, has plans to build a $9.4 billion petrochemical complex just an hour west of here in St. James Parish, Louisiana. They've gotten $1.4 billion of local tax breaks, and this facility would be a huge disaster for the environment. Here on the left, you can see, this is the wetlands right there. It's agricultural land mostly. Some wetlands. On the right, that's a picture of a chemical explosion at a Formosa facility in Illinois in 2004. Just a picture of what's going to happen to this landscape. And the facility would emit over 800 tons per year of toxics like benzene and formaldehyde, and be one of the nation's largest emitters of ethylene oxide, which causes cancer. So this Formosa is also, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Industry is planning a huge expansion of plastics production all over the U.S., centered mostly in the Gulf and in Appalachia, to be closer to the feedstock, which is the fracked natural gas that is then turned into these pellets and flakes that are then turned into resins and melted down into consumer products. Industry is planning to expand production by 40% in the next 10 years. These facilities cumulatively would have the greenhouse gas emissions of 74 new coal-fired power plants. And as we talked about before, recycling is not going to get us out of this problem. The only way really is to address the production. So there is a coalition in St. James that is fighting so hard against Formosa. These are some of the groups, all the groups that are involved, especially the most notable one, Rise St. James, is a local group of residents. It's a faith-based environmental justice organization. The founder, Sharon Levine, has even testified in front of the House Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change of the Committee on Energy and Commerce about the challenges facing frontline communities. They're situated in Cancer Alley, so there's the highest rate of airborne cancers caused by airborne toxins, one of the highest rates in the country. They're going to funerals. Sharon said she's been to a dozen funerals this year alone. So next I'm going to talk about the legal actions that the Center for Biological Diversity is involved in to stop this plant. There are two permit challenges. The first one is a NEPA and well, it's based on the Clean Water Act Section 404 permit that the Army Corps of Engineers granted to Formosa for this project. It's brought by some of the members of the coalition from the previous slide, and it was filed in January of this year and alleges violations of NEPA. So the Army Corps did not make environmental impact statement. They said the impacts from the facility would be less than significant. We're also alleging violations of the National Historic Preservation Act. So there's evidence, well, at the site there are two grave sites where slaves were buried. Because it's located on a former plantation. So this is Sharon standing on one of the grave sites, the Buena Vista grave site. There's also the Acadia grave site nearby. And Formosa hired an archaeologist who went to the site, and then an independent expert went later and discovered that Formosa had looked for remains in the wrong area. And there's evidence, we FOIA'd the Army Corps, and the Army Corps knew that this independent expert had gone to the State Historic Preservation Organization and said, look, this Formosa's expert didn't look for the remains in the right place. But nevertheless, they completed the NHPA process. So there's also, under the Clean Water Act, the Army Corps has to do a public interest analysis, and that's another claim that we're bringing, is that the public interest analysis was flawed. Next, in just a couple weeks ago, Earth Justice brought a petition against the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, and the center is one of the petitioners, along with Rise St. James and some other groups, and it is appealing the air permit that Formosa received. So there are 10 chemical plants and then a utility wastewater treatment plant, and so in total I think they got 14 Title V permits and 1 PSD permit. So the assignments of error are that there are numerous. There's over a dozen assignments of error in the initial petition, and they include alleged violation of the Clean Air Act because Formosa's own modeling showed that the plant would go beyond limits for PM 2.5 and for nitrogen oxides in the area, but then they redid the modeling using a different analysis that has been problematized in court and debunked to show that it would all be okay. And then again, there's this Article 9 of the Louisiana Constitution, which is the public trust. So one of the assignments of error is that obviously this project is not. By permitting this project, Louisiana DEQ was not acting in the public trust, in the best interest of the public trust. So what I mentioned before about also, zooming out to the national level, these plants like Formosa in St. James are so problematic and should not be built. But these permit appeals are very resource intensive and difficult to pursue. So one strategy for ensuring that these microplastics and air pollution are controlled and not impacting communities in this way is to change regulations at a national level. So at the center, we have submitted 2 petitions for rulemaking to EPA. The first is a petition to revise the Clean Water Act's effluent limitation guidelines so that this zero discharge limit that Diane and David won is applied to all new facilities. Also, just updating some of these technology-based standards. Some of them haven't been updated since the 80s. There's new technology out there to reduce the effluent. And also some of the most problematic toxins are not regulated, like dioxins, under these Clean Water Act provisions that we're asking for updates under. Another petition we submitted is a petition for updates to EPA's Clean Air Act regulations under Section 111 and 112 of the Clean Air Act. So these are asking for updates to the new source performance standards and the national emissions standards for hazardous air pollutants. Some of these are really ambitious, like make sure that all these plants are fueled by only zero emissions energy. Some of them address low-hanging fruit. Oops. Like if a leak is detected, these facilities will have miles and miles of pipelines, and each time there's a joint or a connection, there's a leak. So if a leak is discovered now, an operator can wait a month to fix it. So let's shorten that up, 7 days, and outlaw flares unless they're necessary to prevent an explosion. And also just drastically decrease the level of emissions that are allowed from these facilities. Oh, and require fence line monitoring for all the facilities. Like for refineries, fence line monitoring is required, but only for benzene. So let's monitor for a whole host of toxics. So a lot of these proposals that we put forth have been incorporated into this new bill that this is Senator Tom Udall from New Mexico who's introducing it. And the co-author is Representative Lowenthal from California. There's no Republican co-sponsors. There's not a chance that it's going to pass, but it's a really great bill, and it addresses a whole host of issues like extended producer responsibility and banning some single-use items. But what one of our contributions to the bill was asking for a pause on permitting of these new facilities until regulations that implement the suggestions we put forth in our petitions are made into new regulations. So that is, the pause proposed is, I think, 3 years until EPA can really ensure that these facilities are properly regulated and emissions are adequately controlled. And I think I'll leave it at that so we can answer some questions. Thank you.